Okay, so we are now live on YouTube. So welcome everybody to our seminar series, Being Singular. So my name is Gregory Moss, and I am hosting this seminar series with my colleague, Alessandro, whom you see before you there. So before we get started, I'd like to just welcome everyone who's here on the Zoom call, and then everyone who is joining us via YouTube. So this is being live streamed in real time, but the video will also be available as long as the speakers give their consent in the future. So you can come back and watch it later or focus on the parts that are of more interest to you. So before we jump in, I thought just some notes about how the seminar is going to run. We'll be having this seminar, we'll be having different speakers come by and give talks on singularity over the spring, the summer, and the fall terms of this year. And Alessandro and I are also planning on having a second series next year in 2025. So you can look out for that. So I'm going to go ahead and just give you a brief description of the idea of the series. And then after that, we'll have some short introductions for those participants in the series for this round. And then we'll go ahead and introduce our speaker today and get going. Okay, so being singular. A bizarre paradox runs through the history of philosophy. Since the time of Aristotle, philosophy has been defined as the knowledge of the universal, and what is singular has been excluded from the domain of what is knowable. But at the same time, the history of philosophy has continually been confronted, starting with Aristotle and even earlier with Plato, with the problem of knowing what it means to be singular. The notion of singularity is intertwined with and yet distinguished from other fundamental terms in the philosophical lexicon. The one, the individual, individuality, the person, the absolute, but also the contingent, the unrepeatable, the unexpected. It seems to be at the same time what is lowest and irrelevant, a detail or contingency, and what is supreme and of utmost importance, the absolute or God. The singular connotes both the differentiated particular, this here, such as Socrates, and the hen kai pan, the one and all, the one and only, the singular itself. In modern thought, the possibility of clearly distinguishing between singular and the universal has been radically called into question. Philosophical interest in both history and art has led to challenge the idea that philosophy cannot conceive of the singular. The birth of aesthetics and philosophy of history, as well as the philosophical meditation on the contingent aspects of human life, constitute a new stage in the relationship of philosophical thought to the category of the singular. In the history of modern philosophy, we discover an ambitious attempts to rethink the form and structure of logic in order to make knowable the singular. Take, for example, Hegel's case, where the singular is not only an element of the concept, Begriff, but is itself the whole concept, the Begriff, both an element of the whole and the whole itself. The aim of this seminar series, Being Singular, is to discuss the concept of the singular, starting from the history of philosophical thought, but also in relation to the use of the term in contemporary debates. It is our view, Alessandro and I think I could say, speaking for the both of us here as I give these introductory remarks, these are shared thoughts here, is that philosophy today has yet to fully come to terms with the concept of the singular, and that thinking deeply about this concept can help us shed light on some theoretical problems still open and pertinent today. So I'm just going to also note some questions that Alessandro and I have been thinking about, and we're hoping that as we go through this series, that some of these questions will be addressed as we go along. What does it mean to be singular? What is the difference between the singular and the individual? What is the difference between the singular and the one? Is the world itself, the totality of beings, itself a singularity? What is the relation between singular, plural, and totality? What is the relationship between the universal, particular, and the singular? Can singularities be known? And if they can be known, how can they be known? Is singularity a grammatical, logical, or ontological category, if it's a category at all? These are just some of the questions that we're interested in exploring, and we're also excited to see what new questions will come up for us as we learn from all the speakers. So before we jump in, maybe we could just have a few moments of introduction for I think the five, or I think there's about three of you here who will be giving talks in the series. So maybe I'll start with myself, and we'll go to Alessandro, and then we can go to Martin, and then Francesco, and go. We can all briefly introduce ourselves. So my name is Gregory Moss. I'm an associate professor of philosophy, and I wrote a book on singularity, on Hegel's notion of singularity, Hegel's Foundation for Metaphysics, Logic of Singularity. So I'm very interested in this concept, and I'm interested in exploring it outside of the confines of Hegel in particular. Looking forward to the talks. Alessandro, maybe just say a word about yourself.
Yeah, with pleasure. Hello, everyone. And many thanks to Gregory for the beautiful introduction. I'm Alessandro De Cesaris. I collaborate with the Chair of Aesthetics and Philosophy of Art at the University of Fribourg, or Freiburg in Switzerland. I also wrote a book on Hegel's notion of singularity, with particular reference to his logic. Unfortunately, it's in Italian, but I'm planning to, I'm working on a book proposal for a completely different book on the same topic in English, so maybe something will appear in English about the topic for myself as well. And I started out actually as an Aristotle scholar. So my interest for singularity was started with by studying ancient Greek philosophy, and now it went on with Hegel, and now I'm also interested in the contemporary debate. So I really look forward to having these discussions with all of you. And I know Francesco Di Maio and Gaetano Chiurazzi are two great experts on the topic. So I leave the floor, so maybe to Francesco and then to Gaetano, if they want to also to do a brief presentation of themselves.
Francesco?
Okay. So thanks. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I'm Francesco Di Maio. I'm a postdoc researcher at the University of Bologna. I'm working now on the aesthetic of city, but also I worked a lot on the problem of individuality. I wrote a book on Gilles Deleuze and Johannes Duns Scotus on the problem on the university of being and the problem of in the process of individuation. And my research and PhD was about Schelling and the problem of space. There's also a lot of discussion about singularity and individuality. So it's such a pleasure to be here to give my contribution to the seminar. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Gaetano, if you want to say something as well.
Yes, okay. Hello, I am Gaetano Chiurazzi, and I am professor of philosophy at the University of Turin in Italy. So I am interested in German classical philosophy, Kant, Hegel, but also more contemporary philosophers, contemporary so to say, Husserl and Heidegger, ancient philosophy too, above all Plato, and topics as metaphysics, ontology, philosophy of translation, and theory of judgment. And I published in 2017 a book on the concept of incommensurable, starting from its discovery in ancient Greece. So that's all.
Wonderful. And maybe, and now I'll take the opportunity to introduce our first speaker, Professor Martin Donougho. And then Martin, if you would like to add anything else about yourself after my introductory remarks, please feel free to do so. Okay, so our first speaker today is Professor Martin Donougho. He is a professor emeritus in philosophy at the University of South Carolina. He has interests in continental philosophy, Hegel in particular, as we'll hear today, aesthetics. I understand a lot of work done on aesthetics and other topics. He has a recent book, which is entitled Hegel's Individuality, Beyond Category. And I believe, Martin, you have a copy of that book with you. Maybe you could show us The book recently published
Is
with
it?
Paul Grave. Yeah, you could even bring it up a little closer there. Paul Grave Macmillan. Yes, published with Paul Grave Macmillan, 2023, right? So I believe that was just last year. So a very recent book. So if you haven't taken a look at it, hopefully after the talk today, you will find it of interest. You can check it out in your own time. Okay, so today we're going to hear a talk entitled Individuality versus Singularity in Hegel, Preliminary Thoughts. So please, the floor is yours, Martin. Thanks so much.
Okay, I'm going to time myself so I don't go over. There we go. Yes, I'm Martin Donougho, and as you can tell, I'm from various places. I grew up in England, but then I did my graduate work in Canada, and now I'm in the USA, and I taught for 30 years at the University of South Carolina. So I have various nationalities, and my accent is all over the place, but I hope you can understand it. If not, yell, and I'll try and make it more understandable. Yes, I did give you a handout, and you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to talk about everything that's on the handout, but it gives you a rough idea about what my book is about. I should start by saying I'm delighted to be part of this seminar, and I should thank the organizers for setting things going. And I look forward to discussion of this strange concept, and not just in Hegel's thinking of individuality. And my book is on individuality rather than singularity, though I think they'll come together, I hope. So I focus on individuality, both concept and reality, and not singularity. Individuality appears quite unfamiliar in Hegel's studies, as I found when I wrote this book, Hegel's Individuality, and I draw on some of its ideas in what follows, since I don't think anyone's read the book, but encourage you to do so. Hegel draws a very sharp distinction between individuality and Einzelheit, singularity. Too sharp, perhaps, since they are related dialectically, at least, if only by inclusion or overgrasping, überreichen in German, which I think is an important category, certainly for individuality. Talking about the one might disclose something about the other. Yet it's hard not to be struck by Hegel's habitual setting them at odds. He presents individuality as escaping, for example, singular detail, fixed traits. In translations and commentary, as Alessandro mentioned, the two concepts are very often not distinguished, even though they typically operate very differently. And I'll indicate some instances along the way. And that goes even for some well-known authorities in the field. And I have here, I won't name names, but I will mention one name, someone I quite admire. Elisabeth Rosa wrote a book translated as Modern Individuality in Hegel's Practical Philosophy, 2012. Never once mentions individuality. So this is the paradox, that it just is not there. It's disappeared somewhere. And there are other eminent authorities the same. So my book is a plea for closer attention to individuality's appearance in Hegel's texts. It came to play a central role, notably in the phenomenology, and in my original focus of interest, the aesthetics. I started out with Hegel's aesthetics. And the words first came to my attention when I'd been asked to assess several journal submissions on the topic of Hegel's conception of tragedy, and I realized how crucial, if equivocal, a role individuality played there. Hegel takes classical tragedy to represent a normative collision within the polis, essentially between singularity, public, active, masculine, and universality, private, familial, feminine. And I know this is an ancient duality, not Hegel's. The Greek ideal is not Hegel's ideal, though he thought highly of it. Each side mediates singular and universal moments, and so it qualifies as individuality. A third kind of individuality found in Hegel's text comprises autonomous processes of bodily decay and burial. They're their own system, if you like, their own individual microbes and so on. And a fourth, more respectable than that, is the brother-sister relation, which Hegel controversially understands as pure, untainted by desire. And fifth, there's the general earth individuality, a fifth order, earthly rather than celestial, and that's important for his philosophy of nature. In the Phenomenology, he gives us a picture of symbiosis, whereby the family supplies warriors for political action and later reclaims their bodies for cultic remembrance, that is, bestowing on its singularity a universal significance escaping physical decay. The only good hero is a dead hero from their point of view. In 2006, I wrote an article. I tried to sort out my own thoughts on the various textual intricacies, and I later broadened my approach beyond that brief section in the Phenomenology. And it's a very complex section, which I won't be talking about today, but we can talk about it if you want. An important point, a third point really, it became clear to me that Hegel was in effect joining a lively conversation about Individualität from Leibniz to the Romantics. And if you look at my summary, you'll see all the names that were involved. And this surprised me. Leibniz, Herder, Goethe, Fichte, Schleiermacher, Humboldt, and Schlegel, they all put individuality at the center of their thinking. And Hegel, though he didn't admit it, was joining that conversation. Another point, I realized also there were definite grounds, social and philosophical, for that conversation to emerge in the late 18th century, when individuality as concept and social practice fully emerged as a problematic thing. And I'd drawn the ideas of Niklas Luhmann for that, some very interesting essays he wrote. So in what follows, I briefly sketch my larger argument in the book, and then I glance at possible meanings of individuality, which is difficult. That's difficult to do when, by definition, it resists definition. So I tried to come up with some informal ideas about what individuality in general amounts to. Then I spend some time on examples of Hegel's usage, though I can't go into details. The trees and the forest, there's a problem there, but I'll try and get some idea across. And then at the end, I'll ask whether Hegel's stark contrast of the two terms mightn't hide some sort of continuity between them. And I really don't have an answer to this, but I have a few ideas that I'll present. And I would like maybe just to suggest that Hegel is very coy about the term. It's not on a par with his other logical operators, and he never discusses it. And I wonder quite why that is. And one suggestion might be that Schleiermacher made a big thing of individuality, so that's why he didn't talk about it. He didn't want to compare himself with Schleiermacher. They were at odds. Okay, so my argument, which is on the handout, but I'll quickly go through it. In brief, it's that Hegel, first of all, that Hegel engages with a historically important conversation about individuality, emergent in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And two, that individuality plays a surprisingly important, although often tacit role throughout his system. The category is crucial to his phenomenology of spirit, 1807, but also to the physics, the organics, and the anthropology, divisions within the encyclopedia. The first two from philosophy of nature, the last from philosophy of spirit. It's central to the philosophy of history, the beautiful individuality of ancient Greece, and especially to Hegel's aesthetics, where it appears hundreds of times, admittedly in honorific more than technical, let alone dialectical usage. But unfortunately, I won't get to the aesthetics, but we can talk about it if you want. And we can talk about also, for example, the philosophy of right, where it hardly appears at all. And perhaps there are reasons for that. Another claim, difficult to convey in short order, that individuality brings out a certain pragmatics as opposed to semantics or syntactics in Hegel's usage. And here I may be going against Greg's idea that it's a metaphysical notion. I'm looking at the pragmatics, which draw attention to the tacit rather than overt assumptions at work in any particular instance, and to implicit terms of address or reception. Considered as a category, individuality will often seem slippery, informal, or indeterminate in application, with no set meaning or rules to guide its construal. Behaving in highly flexible fashion nevertheless primes it to play a distinctive yet versatile role in Hegel's texts. with great advantage to his dialectical mode of presentation. It also requires readers to keep their wits about them when following his exposition or analysis. We are enjoined actively to construe what participants or practices might themselves construe or misconstrue in their dealings and situations. So individuality is tailor-made for this kind of role play. And if the previous point turns on tacit usage, a further point requires an explicit sociological or social-political sense, namely that individuality is all too easily confused with individualism. The issue might seem peripheral. Its impact is not. Equating the two expressions needlessly muddles discussion and also serves to underline the fact that concepts and categories do not subsist in a historical vacuum, nor are they independent of their social context. And I draw particularly on Niklas Luhmann, as I mentioned, to help define and come to grips with the concept. It's no accident that Niklas Luhmann's systems theory bears a distinct likeness to Hegel's logic. I explore how, for Hegel, individuality is embedded in community theoretically and in socio-historical fact. And a final point that I won't make much of, but I think it's important, that we should beware the dangers of anachronism in general, but especially in Hegel scholarship. It's all the more urgent given Hegel's occasional appeal to it. Thus, when dealing with ideas of self, person, or individual, it's tempting, even unavoidable, to export current approaches to other cultures or periods. For example, treating Sophocles' Antigone as a modern character or subject. Or again, Hegel's aesthetics offers a sophisticated interpretation of art as both concept and cultural formation, as a theory and a historical practice first conceptualized as art in the singular. An anthropologist friend of mine talked about art because it's so important. It first came into its own during Hegel's own time, thanks to the very romantics he was at pains to criticize and keep at bay. What Winkelmann called the ideal, epitome of art and artwork centered on aesthetic individuality, is essentially a view from abroad, not least because individuality as a self-aware category stems from the late 1700s. So the paradox is we invent the Greek ideal. How do we come to terms with that? Now, it's true that the term individuality needs clarification, which requires teasing out its very significance as in this historically labile arena. Moreover, while the term operates powerfully in Hegel's texts, it's often between the lines. Dictionary definitions offer little help. So I will quickly summarize an attempt to do so, but I'm not going to go into detail. I begin with an advertisement for a Quaker retirement community near Philadelphia, which includes a declaration of principle. The power behind our community is individuality. Their point being that good Quakers will pay attention to the particular individual, but also to the community in which they operate. And I think that duality is important. And then cite a book by literary critic Edward Mendelssohn called The Things That Matter, 2006. He borrows his title from Virginia Woolf, but in some ways it's Hegelian because he has this category, die Sache selbst, the thing that matters. And Mendelssohn looks at novels, English novels, that deal with characters who are individuals operating in environments that define them, but which they define too. Another category is social contingency. Individuality is all the more valuable for being sought in post-traditional society, and this is where Luhmann comes in. Individuality is a precarious notion. It becomes a way of thinking of people who are not included in the social stratum, the traditional kind of thinking. And Niklas Luhmann has a very subtle account of its emergence. Another category I think important is pragmatics. And here I draw a little bit on Habermas in his post-metaphysical thinking, where he argues that individuality emerges out of Leibniz, and he traces it into modern times with Humboldt and Kierkegaard especially. And in terms of language, language which can be performative and encourages other people to understand what you've just said. I also bring in Stanley Cavell, who has an opposite perspective, a negative perspective, language as a medium that exists for others, and all too easily leads to conformity, as Emerson would say. And Kierkegaard himself felt that same threat. I say something, but who knows if an alien power is speaking me rather than me speaking the words. And I think that's a very important theme in the 19th century. And you can trace it in Hegel too. Another category, I'll just mention it, friends. Finding agreement with others is equally uncertain. Nietzsche's Zarathustra repeats the claim, my friends, there are no friends. Others misconstrue the task or fail to carry it through. And such desperate appeal to others is the moment of intense self-awareness superbly caught, I had to mention this, by Monty Python's Life of Brian, if you've seen the film, 1979, when Harry Brian addresses the crowd beneath his window, you don't need to follow me. You don't need to follow anybody. You've got to think for yourselves. You're all individuals. The crowd, yes, we're all individuals. Brian, you're all different. The crowd, yes, we're all different. Quavering voice, I'm not. Crowd, shh. And this presents the problem in a nutshell. And I wanted this quote as an epigraph for the whole book, but because of copyright problems, I was told that it counted as a vanity citation, and so I had to put it into a footnote instead. It wasn't fair use. Another couple of points very quickly. Reflective judgment, I think this is important too. Judgment is neither objective nor subjective, but reflecting, in this case, in Kantian terms, it internalizes the context or conditions in which it's passed. Kant's critique of aesthetic judgment was, according to Alfred Bäumler, the first to formulate a radical idea of individuality. I judge something beautiful and think others should too, but I have no real expectations. I'd be surprised if they did. I put myself on the line here without appeal to any kind of rule. And very quickly, another category I came across, individuality. I'll quickly mention this. Volker Gerhardt, in a book of 2000, Individualität, recommends Shaftesbury's divide yourself or be two, a individuality. Shaftesbury didn't use the word. The OED awards primacy to Francis Galton in 1883 in English. He said, individuality replaces individuality. And another person, I don't have it here, but others have said so too. Social anthropologists have used it. Marilyn Strathern, a specialist in Melanesian cultures, credits Daniel Miller's Stuff, that's his book, Stuff, with borrowing Hegel's idea that property can enhance abstract personhood. It reverses perspective so as to individuate the self ab extra through social objectification. You are what you own, your stuff, but you don't own it, it owns you. And this again has Hegelian resonances, for example, in the book on Bildung, in the chapter on Bildung in the Phenomenology. Lastly, and actually the one that's most relevant to our theme, nature, individuation continues to be a major challenge in science, biology in particular. How to sort things like dandelions, quaking aspens, mushrooms, jellyfish, coral reefs, or the bacteria in your gut. I don't know if you thought much about it, but it's difficult to define or come to terms with individuality there. And the same in physics. May we conceive the workings of certain systems as normative in some way, a kind of self-relation or even quasi-subjectivity, selbstisch, as Hegel would say. Physical bodies might escape causal laws and be thought of as self-regulating, and that's really the center of Hegel's idea of physics. Okay, so that's various ideas of individuality in general. And I want to turn now to, how am I doing on time? Well, another quarter of an hour maybe, if that's okay. Hegel's individuality, gauging what he means by the term, is a major challenge. How typical is his usage, and where might it diverge from the romantics of his time? Almost nobody has paid attention to it, and that should in itself give us pause. It could be a wild goose chase after all, but it is a concern. On the crucial distinction of Individualität from Einzelheit, Anglophone readers can be misled by the usual translation, which has already been mentioned, of Einzelheit as individuality. In their preface to the Encyclopedia Logic, two of the translators, Geretz and Harris, note that the decision to reserve singularity for Einzelheit came from Harris's insistence that, and I quote, an important quote, individuality is what belongs to the concrete thinking of the logician, who unites the moments and comprehends them in their unity. I should say H.S. Harris was a teacher of mine, and I really thought this was a great thing, this great quote. They add that Hegel occasionally refers non-tautologously to singular individuals. There must be something going on here. In the phenomenology of spirit, we find not just singular individuality, but also universal individuality and even singular singularity. To explore that is a challenge. From its earliest instances in the phenomenology, individuality seems to connote incipient action or fluidity of thought. For example, in the section on the inverted world, I'll say more on it, Die verkehrte Welt, we encounter the idea of punishment as a reciprocal movement of individuality against law and of law against individuality, neither of them set in stone. Or again, with Stoicism, the self-presenting of individuality, not the singular self, note, it emerges as living or thinking activity aimed at grasping the world as a system of thought, or rather thinking. And there are many such instances. Conversely, and this is important, I think, some of the most celebrated sections of the phenomenology turn on Einzelheit, Einzeln, and so on, rather than Individualität. Unhappy consciousness and Lord and bondsman, master-slave, for example, are rooted in singular consciousness and otherness, not in the pure flux of overgrasping, Überreifen, characteristic of individuality. And this is a heterodox view, I think. I may be wrong. Hegelian recognition, too, Anerkennen, happens between singletons. That's a nice word invented by Mary Rowlinson in her book on the phenomenology. Singletons are not individuals. They may aim at full recognition, but it doesn't take place in that section. I leave aside the distinction between individuality and individualism, a word Hegel didn't use, indeed could not know. Individualism was invented around 1830 or so Hegel was lucky not to have known it. So I'm going to offer a very short survey of some of his usage, beginning with his early writings. And the term first occurs in his writings about love, when it conveys a privative or exclusive sense. The individual surrenders its particular self in its beloved, or the individual transcends the romantic model of dyadic love rooted in judgment to embrace a syllogistic in framing of partners as mediated by a third, marriage, social institution of a sort. Individuals lose themselves to find themselves in another framework. A restrictive tinge still marks individuality in the polemical difference essay, critical of Friedrich Schlegel. Its mention here shows Hegel's ambivalence. He seems both to endorse it and to keep his distance. With faith and knowledge, he pivots to defend Kant against Fichte and Jacobi. Jacobi's philosophy, I quote, secures the identity of universal and particular in individuality, but the individuality is subjective. Hegel finds it more deeply realized in Schleiermacher's essay on religion. Only with the essay on natural law does individuality play a larger and integral structure beyond singularity. He observes that ethical totalities such as peoples, Völker, take shape and constitute themselves as individuals. And he enunciates an important principle. This connection, Beziehung, of individuality to individuality is a relation, and accordingly twofold, positive coexistence plus negative exclusion. Yet both connections are absolutely necessary. Now, at this stage, the necessity cannot be thought. It can only be represented as tragedy. So philosophy is tragedy. And famously, he wrote, "This is nothing but the performance in the ethical realm of the tragedy which the absolute eternally enacts within itself by sacrificing itself to the forces of objectivity, which is both natural law, but also modern Scottish political economy. I'm going to ignore the complexities of the Jena system, though I do note that in their final dealings with art, art becomes a matter of singularity. The artist becomes a singleton. He writes about or creates objects which are singular rather than individual. Beyond that is religion, and Christ is an actual self, this singular. So in this case, singular comes into its own beyond art. I'm going to move quickly to the phenomenology and the first proper instance of individuality in chapter 3 in the inverted world. And in fact, there are two inversions, the second explaining how the first inner order of law applies to the empirical world as the inversion of the inversion. This goes both for natural and juridical orders. Hegel cites the supreme satisfaction of injured individuality in taking revenge. Justification of that act requires treating the other too as an individuality which, by invoking a supersensible realm of moral standing, ends up honoring and indeed pardoning the transgressor. The one moment encompasses the other. In the result, the law remains both at rest and in force. The movement of individuality against it, the law, and of it against individuality is extinguished. So the odd thing is, there's no need for punishment. We realize why there's no need for punishment. We just let things stand. The law has been enacted. The individualities acknowledge their mirror images through a dialectic of forgiveness, craved and granted, a dialectic echoed at the close of chapter 6 on the beautiful soul. I was going to introduce a brief excursus on the absolute mechanism in the logic, which actually has a lot to say about how law isn't just a rule which is contingently followed, but a proper law executes itself, applies of its own term, of its own force, if you like. And this is the same kind of thing, a kind of a circle of self-distinction, self-determination. Okay, let me move to a second instance, and I might shorten this. With life, the category of life at the beginning of chapter 4 of self-consciousness, it comprises both the process of life and the living being, or the individual organism, which the organism resists the fluidity of life itself so as to preserve its own shape and identity. It further preserves itself by engendering another individuality, its offspring, a second cycle, one of reproduction. Another instance which I've mentioned, lordship bondsman, when a singular self-consciousness opposes another singleton relating to it in the mode of desire. Famous though the struggle for recognition there's nothing there on individuality. And that echoes Jena 1 and 3. So I'm going to put it aside and move to unhappy consciousness. Here you'd expect individuality to be showcased, especially since Schleiermacher and Kierkegaard both put store by the concept. But the opposite is the case. Instead of Individualität or Individuum, Einzelheit and Einzelner, rendered by Miller as individuality and individual, fill every paragraph. Hegel shuns talk of individuality precisely to show the narrow defile singular consciousness must pass through, losing itself only to find itself again in a community which will eventually, in chapter 5, constitute science and on a secular quest to find rationality in the human world. And much of the work done by individuality occurs there. It shows the category stretching its wings, so to speak, to encompass opposite moments of singular and universal, now as singular, now as universal individuality, and sometimes stubbornly as singular singularity when it refuses to take flight. He considers the way in which rationality shows up in natural phenomena or human behavior, first in scientific observation, second in structures and shapes of social action, and Lost myself here. Oh, I've lost myself in a. Maybe I'll just jump. Well, I'm not going to spend much time, but I'll just mention in psychology, which is observation of human beings, he condemns the attitude that understands faculties and inclinations as just singular items in a bag, rather than actual individualities with a mind of their own. Psychology looks for laws linking the separate moments, laws of influence of one over the other. But the project is circular, since what exerts an influence on individuality depends on individuality. So the two actually are both sides. And he moves on to discuss physiognomy and phrenology, which I'm not going to go into, but they are superb studies of how it's a kind of circularity that never escapes its own pseudo-explanation. To cut a long story short, he says the being of spirit or mind must be something more and other than these bones, the skull bone. A hint at what it might be or might include has already been given when Hegel rules out the possibility that the skull is a sign, like a look or a gesture or signpost. He says, with a skull, you may well imagine all sorts of things, as Hamlet does with Yorick's skull. Yet it's just a bone. This passing remark is highly significant, though the skull is not. For what intervenes now is reflection and memory. They serve to fill out the void of the middle term, the active link between inner and outer. That is Hamlet's, alas, poor Yorick, I knew him ratio. This turn inward to memory, toward intersubjective interpretation, is the fulcrum upon which the phenomenology stands or turns. All right, I'm not going to go into spirit and so on. I was going to talk about Faust, but really I won't. It's fascinating, but anyone who knows this section knows how to individuality doubles itself. It becomes a double, even triple fugue in Bachian terms. Bach does this kind of thing, and it's very complicated. I think I want to move on to just a few minutes on the physics, and then perhaps we'll stop. The physics is the major arena, in fact, for Hegel's deployment of the term Individualität. It's part 2 of the encyclopedia, the philosophy of the science of physics. Although his approach is often accused of a priorism, the truth is rather that his tireless efforts at reconstructing the rational structure of nature tend to track quite closely the theories and evidence generally available to him. Indeed, the fact that much of Hegelian physics contains outdated ideas, phenomena, or the scientific consensus on fact, serves to show that he did not simply devise his own ideas from whole cloth via Schelling's construction. He's not simply against scientific abstraction. What he does contest is any move reductively to blur qualitative difference, and Thomas Posch points that out. Hegel takes philosophy to seek this middle way between abstract laws posited as ruling over nature and a descriptive or experiential fidelity to its copious detail. What is intuitive must also be thought, he declares. Moreover, what might seem homegrown or naive, for example, his theory of elements, show him attempting precisely to avoid reduction either to abstract laws or to metaphysical substances, forces, for example. So the framing concept of individuality, a necessary advance beyond mechanics, is found not in empirical science, but rather in the philosopher's thinking regard. I've seen no reference to that category by scientists of his time, but maybe they should have used it, I don't know. But I do note that I don't know if people have heard of the so-called Foreman hypothesis. Paul Foreman in the early 2000s, did a sociological analysis of why quantum physicists in the 1920s in Germany used Individualität to try and come up with an idea of quantum physics as Individualität, which would move beyond mechanical physics. they try to make it acceptable. Nor, if we heed Hegel's warning, will its authority derive from external analogy, as if nature behaved like a human expression and self-formation. So individuality is not an as if, it really is how nature operates in its own terms. And he divides then the sphere of physics into universal individuality, the solar system, for example. It goes by itself, if you like. Each member of the system is also the whole. It's both at once. And then various other things, aggregate states like gases, plasma, liquids, solid state physics, if you like. He then moves on to consider individual elements, air, fire, water, earth. This is where it sounds very old-fashioned or merely poetic. But in fact, it's a way of trying to think of physics, as I say, in its own terms. Oops, that's my 35 minutes. Can I wrap up in just 2 minutes? Is that reasonable?
Yes, you can even take up to 10 more if you'd like. It's fine.
Oh, okay. Well, I won't bore you by going on too long. But I just want to mention something else, because this idea of something which is considered in its own terms, as self-determining, if you like, as individuality in that sense, an integral way of thinking of the world, can be quite respectable. And I've come up with the category can be thought of as stipulative or pragmatic, and akin to, and is another name familiar maybe, Faraday's well-known assertion, cited approvingly by Wittgenstein, that water is one individual thing. It never changes. This is in a wonderful book called The Chemical History of a Candle. Wittgenstein loved this work because it's a way in which you don't resort to explanation by reference to another sphere entirely, but it thinks in its own terms of what is there. And it's another reason why Wittgenstein loved Goethe, because Goethe could do the same sort of thing with his botany. The second sphere is particular individuality, the return of individuality, the physics of form and shape, density, cohesion, sound, and heat. And lastly, total individuality, the return of individuality to itself from externality. Matter becomes informed matter. Magnetism is one example. Another kind would be color, texture, sight, smell, taste, culminating in individuation as electrical current. But again, current is not a metaphysical entity. What you see is what you see, to quote an artist who just died last week. What you sense is what you sense. I'm going to close then quickly. I'm going to jump over another sphere of the philosophy of nature, plant individuality, and talk briefly, very briefly, about habit, which has become a major focus of interest in Anglo philosophy, Anglo-centric philosophy more recently. Habits seem to be something that make humans a slave to something physical, something out there. But Hegel argues that we can make sense of habits, somehow make them at one with ourselves. But how he does this is quite mysterious. He has to go through what you might call the detour of madness. So before we get anywhere, we have to go mad, if you like. We have to lose ourselves with no secure grasp of ourselves in madness, where we're beside ourselves. How then can we find ourselves and also the world? We lose our sense of or feeling for the world as well as ourselves. And he says that self-feeling offers a way out, a way of distinguishing ourselves from ourselves, and then says that habit is how this happens. Never actually says exactly how, but habits can escape this singular dependence on traits and achieve freedom and individuality because the soul in habit can transform particular determinations in such a way that they're situated in a general disposition and capacity. It articulates a generality in such a way that it takes on a particular shape in the guise of specific habits. So we take on habits as ourselves. The self is a collection of habits, but we've unified them as ourselves. And yet there's no basis for it. That's just who we are. This kind of bootstrapping, autopoiesis, to use another systems term, introduces stability into my feelings and thus paves the way for perceptual consciousness. And I quote John McCumber, a fellow student of mine, habits are no longer me, but mine. And that's how I make them subjective. Madness, the self loses its bearings, there's no foundation. But I find myself in habit. It's habits all the way down, so to speak. All right, well, I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more, obviously, but it gives you, I hope, a sense in which individuality collects up a number of ways of thinking of the world in their own terms. And that's really what individuality is supposed to do in Hegel's hands. Okay, let me just stop. Oh, I was going to say something about how I think singularity can be related to individuality, but I'm going to put that aside. Maybe it'll come up later.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this very rich and informative talk,
Thanks.
Martin. And I think so we have some time for questions. And so we'll just open it up to first the internal to Zoom itself. So if you have a question, I prefer if you simply use the chat function and put your name in the chat function, or no need to put your whole question there. Just put your name in the chat function, or simply raise your hand either on the screen or in the under the reactions button. Just raise your hand, and then I will happily give you the floor. Okay, let's begin with Alessandro. Take it away.
Yes, thank you, Gregory, and thank you, Martin, for this very, very dense presentation of the issue. First of all, because I believe it's already very, very important to show how relevant and how pivotal these two notions, namely individuality and singularity, are throughout Hegel's system. So this was maybe something that can also be interesting in order to put some context into this seminar series. It was not on purpose, but it is, of course, I'm really happy that we started out with a talk on Hegel's philosophy, which in a way maybe can be also seen as counterintuitive if one looks at the debate, because usually Hegel's philosophy is not connected with the notion of singularity or of individuality. And one could maybe say, I remember at the end of your handout, you mentioned Feuerbach and Kierkegaard and other philosophers of singularity or other philosophers of individuality, so to say. And in a way, one could say that the very notion of singularity has been developed by some in the modern and then contemporary debate as a response to Hegel's philosophy. So I don't know whether Francesco and Gaetano agree. They are experts of contemporary French thought, for instance, but I do believe that in French contemporary thought there is the express idea of developing the notion of singularity in order to generate some sort of anti-Hegelian system or anti-Hegelian philosophy. So it is very interesting that you can do a philosophy of singularity just reading Hegel, basically. So that's I really enjoyed so following together with you during your talk how many instances of discussion about individuality there are. Basically, I have one question. Maybe I have many questions, but I'd like to start with with one. And I really liked not only the Life of Brian quote, but also the reference to Daniel Miller, the idea of stuff, the idea that in a way, so to say, the individual or so to say, the subject is also determined or defined by his properties. And I always found interesting the ambivalence of the notion of property in this case. Namely, you can speak about property in an economical way, so property as the stuff you own, so to say, or you can speak about property in a metaphysical way, so property as a feature or a attribute, so to say. So one could say it's not meant just as a game, so as a wordplay, but one could say that so individuals are usually defined by their properties, so to say. This is what the tradition told us, that in a way, what one traditional standard way of thinking about individuals is an individual is a being that is individuated, is determined by a set of properties, so to say. And if I get correctly what you said, or I don't know what you think about this, maybe one disruptive element, one really interesting element of Hegel's philosophy is that he follows a completely different strategy. Namely, it's not, so to say, individuality is not just, an individual is not just a being that has a certain set of properties, but individuality is not a set of attributes, but rather a way of being or a way of behaving, a logical structure, so to say. And I find that this maybe is one of the most interesting aspects of Hegel's philosophy, namely maybe one of the aspects where he sets a different path with regard of the tradition, so to say. I don't know if it's clear, if I made myself clear, and what you think about this.
Yes, if I can respond briefly. I mean, maybe I'm just incorrigibly Hegelian, but in the chapter on Bildung, or the section on Bildung, he precisely sets this up as a way in which the subject forms itself or defines itself in various ways. But on the other hand, it's a kind of mirror effect. I am formed by my properties in various ways, by my status as a legal person, but I'm the one doing this. So it goes round and around. And he's trying to come at how this isn't just a way of being subjectivist, but it creates a whole world, if you like, the Western world of technical thinking to some extent. But Bildung is precisely that kind of double move, where, and I know in contemporary psychology and popular thinking, one thinks of it in terms of types. Which type do you belong to? Well, decide. You have to be the one to decide which type you belong to. And it's not just a manner of thinking in objective terms. You have to combine both sides, if that makes sense. And I think that's what Hegel is trying to do, to step in on both sides.
Mm-hmm. So you mean if I get it, you mean, so to say, properties as the result of a certain way of structuring yourself, so to say. So
yes.
Whereas the priority is how you build these properties, how you shape yourself in relation to the world or to the others, and not simply the fact that you have these properties, so to say.
Right. Though disruption actually helps you form yourself. Being utterly without foundation enables you then to start again. And again, that's partly the madness of words. To some extent, Hegel deals with that too. But I know, to another point that you made, can I respond to the point about modern French philosophy? I'm no expert, but I did read up on some of this, and there's a whole host of thinkers like Simondon and Deleuze, of course, who are all trying to escape Hegel and using individualism or individuality to try and do so. But again, it's a very difficult game they're playing, and who knows who wins in the end. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There was a beautiful article by Robert Stern Gilles Deleuze and Hegel, where he really tries to show that Deleuze's notion of singularity and Deleuze's notion of difference can be related to Hegel's notion of concrete universality, so that there is some sort of it is one way of reading the relationship between Hegel and French contemporary thought, namely where some contemporary French philosophers try to develop some theories as a criticism against Hegel. What they end up with is something that could be also interpreted as a specific way of reading Hegel, so to say. So it's that's really part of the debate. But again, we have some experts on this topic. So I believe this will come up again throughout the seminar series, and it will be also interesting to do so. I do not want to take everything to take up all the time of the discussion. So I have other questions, but maybe later I'd like to hear all the other as well. But thank you for your answer. I completely agree with your point.
I have also noted in the YouTube chat, if anyone has questions who's watching on YouTube, there's about 4 or 5 people there. You feel free to type in your question on the chat, and then I will happily read it for you. Okay, while we wait for any other questions, maybe I'll take the honor to ask a question. And I'm really curious about the difference between the singular and the individual. And I know you didn't have enough time to really fill out that distinction or that discussion. But I am really interested in thinking it through better. I've thought a lot about singularity in Hegel, and less about individuality. So together, you and I may be able to put it together. But I'd like to maybe just ask some questions based on what I heard you say today, to kind of raise some questions for me, just as much as for you. So what is I think it was really interesting to see all of the cases of individuality, all the places it comes up. And that was helpful also to follow up for myself to go and read and to see exactly what's going on in all of these texts. I think that was very helpful. But this also just got me wondering, it's kind of piqued my interest. What really is individuality? We have all these, one could say, species of individuality, kinds of individuality. And it seems like they all have something in common that would justify all of them being instances of individuality. But it also, so then one just basic question is, well, what is that genus? What is individuality? Now, maybe it's not so easy to say without looking at a particular example. I mean, you have noted that it escapes fixed traits, and it seems to resist definition. Right. So it does seem, if that's what individuality is, of course, we can't exactly answer that question in any satisfactory way. And it would also, of course, explain why it is that it's not somehow one of the central, say, as you say, categories. But on the other hand, it seems to have there were examples. So this is my general question. What's the difference between the individual and the singular? The singular doesn't seem to escape definition. I would say the singular seems, in Hegel's case, to be the arch example of what is intelligible, what can be conceived, because the singular is, well, the concept is the singular, turns out, is the universal particular singular, and the singular is the whole concept, a determination of it, and an element of it. So the singular seems to be the concept. It is conceptual. Maybe you mean something more narrow, like escapes definition as in that category in the logic. But if you mean something more general, like conceivable, it looks like I'm wondering, is that one of the places where you see a difference between singularity and individuality, or is that not a central place, and why? Because it does seem to me like that Einzelheit and singularity does not resist conceptualization because it is in itself conceptual, actually. So that's my first question, but it's related to the second one. Before I raise the second one, I'm just happy that you gave the Quakers as an example. So I think that was a very Very nice to hear about the Quakers. I'll come back to that if we have more time. My second question is about self-determination, because I think at one point you spoke about self-determining individuality, and maybe also in conversation with Alex, this kind of came up as well. And interesting thing about the singular is I would say the singular is also self-determining, or more particularly, it's self-particularizing. So the concept is this self-particularizing power, and the singular is the whole concept. So the singular should also be a self-particularizing or self-determining power. So then I'm wondering, yeah, individuality can be self-determining, singularity can be self-determining. Are they the same thing? Or is individuality a kind of self-determination, but not the same kind as the concept? These are the kinds of questions that I'm kind of thinking through after I heard your very rich talk with all the examples. So anything you have to say about any of those questions would be very helpful. Where your thoughts are on singular and individual right now. Yeah.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, especially I read your book, and this idea of self-determining and self-particularizing, I think, is a very powerful way of thinking. I mean, it seems to me one difference would be, the way I've set it up anyway, is that there is what I call a pragmatics of individuality, which you wouldn't have with singularity. You emphasize, probably quite rightly, that you have to surrender to the concept. The concept thinks you, but not as individuality, because that's getting back to the pragmatics of self-definition, which I set up, I claim it. So I think the difference would be, one you claim as a kind of metaphysical or an objective self-determination, which I have to, if you like, bow down to before, and the other would be trying to put myself in the equation in some way. I mean, one example which is very rich is the one about the animal kingdom of spirit, which is wonderfully rich, and no one quite knows what it means. But the whole point is, I think it's a way of thinking of the political economy, where each individual sees itself as singular, but also as part of the whole community, and how to think of oneself as both part of society and yet its own self. That's a real challenge. I mean, one part of that would be the self seen as an expressive individual. I am myself in the things I create, in the work that I produce, but that itself is a mirror relation. I've always liked Emerson's idea that the true ship is the shipbuilder, right? And in a sense, it goes both ways. The true shipbuilder is the ship. And that idea of self-expression is one side, but then how do you find it in the community? And that's the further idea that he has to develop in that chapter, in that section. But there again, I don't think it's a metaphysical, it is metaphysical, but it's not self-determination of the concept where you have to decide how it works in its own terms in logic. The thinker has to inject him or herself.
Okay.
If that answers at all.
So already beginning, to make this distinction between the pragmatics of individuality and the metaphysics of the concept. And that's helpful for some cases. But then I start to wonder about the individuality in nature, for example. Do you think another distinction would be needed for those cases? Or do you think there's self-expression of some kind, individuality of some kind going on there that maybe isn't reducible to pragmatics? Or what would that look like in the philosophy of nature?
I agree. It comes unstuck there, right? Because there's no self in magnetism or electricity. It doesn't speak. It doesn't have any characteristics of human nature or human thinking. And neither is it an as if, a kind of analogy. Somehow Hegel wants to have it both ways, or another way that somehow it's self-defining. He uses the term Selbststich or Selbstständigkeit, and that's a real question. And I know there are some thinkers who think that natural beings can be normative even though they're not human in any way.
Yeah.
Maybe going back to an Aristotelian framework. And Hegel's philosophy of nature is Aristotelian in many ways. So I think there is that.
Okay.
Some people say, well, that's just ridiculous, but I think it's a way of saving, a way of thinking about the world without resorting to analogy.
Yes.
Or, yeah.
Definitely think analogy is the wrong way to understand this. I think that I totally agree with you on this point. But yeah, one thing that does make sense to me in the field of nature is that it does make sense for me to think about nature as an expression of the concept and the singularity of the concept. That I can kind of get my head around or my Geist around, if you will, not my head, about how exactly nature may be an expression of the singularity of the concept. Makes good sense to me. But then the pragmatics of individuality, which works really well in some cases, then yeah, it just raises tough questions for us in the field of nature. We have another question from YouTube. We have a question from YouTube, so I hope I don't mind if I go ahead and read that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is from.
Should I access it if I can?
I can read it for you if you'd like.
Oh, okay.
You don't have to worry about it.
Okay.
So this is from Edward Kwok. He's actually a MPhil student of mine here at the Chinese University. So glad to see my students are paying attention to the Hegel talks. All right. So Ed asks, if we say that the individual escapes definition, and if we are now inspecting what it means to be individual, does it mean that we have defined individual as that which escapes definition?
Yeah.
So that's yes. So yeah, so that's
the question. Of course, I could just say yes.
Okay.
Then you look at how it escapes definition, and I think that's a process of thinking that you can then carry through.
Is that something performed? I mean, is this a performative dimension? Because of course it escapes definition, so we define it that way, and it escapes that too, and we're always performing that. Okay, back to the pragmatics again.
Again, I'm trying to think of a good instance to come through with this, but maybe the Hegelian thinking of psychology and the phenomenology, where you're trying to come up with ways of thinking of one's psychic constitution, and yet that has to be expressed. And so you're trying to think both sides at once. And so it's not simply, we cannot define how one side matches the other, but how one side matches the other is itself an attempt at self-definition. So there's a way in which, in thinking about these things, it's also a way of answering that question, how does it define itself? I mean, this is a typical Hegelian procedure that you may think of as unfair, but it starts with this thought of limit, which limits itself, and you then go beyond the limit, and that's really the basis of his whole way of thinking.
Okay, yeah.
But a Heideggerian approach to that would be, well, you've set it up in terms of the subject and its power grab and so on and so forth. So there are always comebacks. I should say, there was another question I wanted to answer quickly that Alessandro had about Feuerbach and Kierkegaard and others, and Stirner. They reacted to Hegel, but it's very tricky because if you just react to him, you're within his power game again. And I think Feuerbach, this is certainly true. He didn't escape. Stirner tried to escape by just ignoring it and just sort of moving beyond the sphere of thinking and becoming this radical self that cannot be thought of at all. And it's an unself, as he called it. Kierkegaard as well, within either or, has the notion of individuality. He takes the Danish, is a direct copy of Hegel's aesthetics, and he's trying to think beyond that theatrical mode. He thinks that Hegel's philosophy is theatrical, it's aesthetic in that sense, and he wants to get beyond it. So there are ways in which you can say that this self-definition in terms of theater, in terms of aesthetics, that itself is something to reject.
I have a text that I'd like to go back to the nature question really briefly, because I just remembered a text that might be of interest in our discussions, because we were talking about how there can be individuality in nature. And there is a passage in which Hegel connects nature with, or at least genera in nature, with the free externality of the concept, the void of the concept. Let me just read it, and I'm just curious if you think he's talking about individuality here. I don't think the term shows up exactly, so I'm just curious whether you think he's talking about individuality here. He says, with respect to completeness, we have just seen that the determinate moment of particularity is complete in the difference of the universal and the particular, and that only these two make up the particular species. To be sure, there are more than two species to be found in any genus in nature, and these many species cannot stand in the same relation to each other, as we have shown. This is the impotence of nature, the Ohnmacht der Natur, that it cannot abide by and exhibit the rigor, Strenge, of the concept and loses itself in a blind manifoldness void of concept. We can wonder at nature at the manifoldness of its genera and species and the infinite diversity of its shapes, for wonder is without concept and its object is the irrational. It is allowed to nature, since nature is the self-externality of the concept, to indulge in this diversity, Verschiedenheit. Just as spirit, even though it possesses the concept in the shape of concept, lets itself go into pictorial representation and runs wild into the infinite manifoldness of the latter. The manifold genera and species of nature must not be esteemed to be anything more than arbitrary notions of spirit, engaged in pictorial representations. Then he goes on to call this the abstract side of nothingness. I'm wondering, is he here talking about individuals? Is infinite manifoldness, this running wild into diversity, the free externality of the concept? Do you think here he's talking about individuals? So like, I also think about Krug's pen. Krug says, deduce this from your system. And of course, Hegel says it's not my job. I'm not going to deduce this. This is one of the free, infinite, although this is an artifact, of course, not just a division of nature. So I'm also wondering whether this has the free externality of the concept, the self-relatedness of the concept, but it's somehow the concept run wild, the Ohnmacht der Natur. I'm wondering if individuality is really this massive space or whether we're talking about something else completely in passages like that. So
I think I know that passage, or I've certainly read something like it.
Yeah, it's from the law, actually, but yeah.
I'm sorry,
it's from the law. He's trying to explain why, after in the logic of the concept, he's divided the concept into just these two species, universal, particular, why there are so many other species in the world and so many different kinds. So I think that's why it came up. So, anyway.
Well, in general terms, I mean, there's the general problem of individuation in nature and in biology and so on. I think what Hegel's trying to find is something that's beyond mere classification. I mean, we can classify nature in all sorts of ways. We can even say that the important classifications are those which are to some extent self-defining. So we'll classify animals in terms of how they survive, in terms of their jaws and their teeth and so on, in terms of how they propagate. So similar species will create similar species, or they won't propagate at all. So I think there's that. But I think what Hegel is trying to do in the philosophy of nature is point to a kind of species that's somehow rooted in the earth. It singularizes itself in nature, if you like. And you might say, well, that's a metaphysical demand. How do we know what singularizes itself in nature? But we want something beyond mere classification, and that's just subjective, but somehow has a necessity of its own that we can track and then write books about. But I think that's how it would be, in his terms, he would see that as the individual that finds itself in the individuality of the earth individuality. And another answer, I think, the one text I was going to quote was from the Science of Logic. I mean, Science of Logic is amazing. It doesn't really mention individuals at all. It compares them with Spinoza a little bit very early, but in the logic of the concept, it comes up again in the idea section on the idea, the idea of life. And you might say, well, what's life doing there? We're dealing with the concept. But the idea of life is one that he tries to get to grips with. And here he again does something that he does a little bit in the phenomenology. Life is both living process, but it's also the living individual. The living individual has the impulse to posit itself as real, not just an abstract moment of conceptual determinacy. It's the impulse of each singular specific moment to produce itself, raise its particularity to universality. And I find it remarkable that the irony, if you like, by which the idea finds its material realization in the body, in the impulse to recreate itself, to reproduce itself. And this is in the logic, for goodness sake. So somehow the body comes in front and center right there. And he goes on to say that generation is important. The logic of generation comes in to create oneself, to recreate oneself, to propagate oneself as a singular. But the singular is also an individual. The germ of a living individual, he goes on to talk about that, which is a propagation not just of my own self in my family, my creation of my family, a living species. It's also the propagation of species as a natural process, generation after generation. And my last comment on that, I haven't got the text here, but I can quickly find it, I think. He actually says that but when you're looking for it, of course, it doesn't turn up. But he does talk about physical conjugation. In other words, the idea of procreation is involved with human physical creation. And this then is, I don't know if it's a joke, something like the joke he offers at the logic of reproduction is also, well, I won't even mention what bodily function it performs, but there is a kind of joke here, it seems to me. I cannot find the text.
While you're looking for that, Alessandro,
but I shouldn't spend time on it. But he does.
No, it's
a kind of joke that Hegel's logic sometimes has, where suddenly the highest concept turns around into the lowest physical object, and I think he does that precisely here. We achieve a logical universality through this physical act.
I mean, there are many interpretations as why in the logic so suddenly physical beings and scientific terms pop up. But I do have, I mean, my way of reading it is that in the objective section of the science of logic, basically is a theory of multiplicity, so to say. And I do believe that this passage from mechanism to chemism to teleology is a way of accounting for different ways of understanding the relationship between the singularities in a multiplicity, so to say. I tend to interpret it in this way, but this is related to the question I wanted to ask you, because in the section on the formal concept, I mean, the science of logic is interesting because there seems to be a progress from singularity to individuality to personality. And so at a certain point, the mechanism, as you also have shown in your abstract, individuality comes up. And then at the beginning of the section on the absolute idea, you have personality. And actually, this is all rooted in an enigmatic sentence. I'm still trying to understand what it means. But in the section on singularity, actually, on the singular, there is this sentence. I have it here in German. Die Einzelheit, das Prinzip der Individualität und Persönlichkeit. So it seems that Hegel understands singularity as some sort of logical principle in order to understand what individuality and what personality are. And to turn to pragmatics, this is maybe not a question, as a proposition. I'm still trying to wrap my geist around your pragmatics thesis. As I understand it, I've always had the impression that individuality is some sort of qualified dynamic relationship between singularities in a multiplicity. So in a way, there is no individuality without without multiple beings, so to say. There is no individuality. I think about mechanism, so the solar system. That you have the first individual is the sun, and it is an individual because it has a dynamic, qualified relationship to other singularities, so to say. So my way of understanding, because it is another counterintuitive idea that individuality comes up in Hegel's philosophy, not with what we usually think as about as individuals. So I don't know, consciousness or conscious beings or living beings and so on, but with planets or with mechanical elements. My way of understanding it is that it is some sort of, in a formula, dynamic, qualified relationship between the singularities in a manifold, so to say. That's how I would understand it. That would also allow me to understand what it means that, so to say, singularity is the principle of individuality and of personality, which is basically the sentence that started me with my interest for the notion of singularity in Hegel's logic, basically. I don't know what you think. I don't know whether
But it seems to me there you're I won't say postponing the problem, but you're moving from singularity to singularities, and the crucial medium there is plurality. Somehow the notion of different singularities somehow is part of the thought of singularity. And I don't know what to think about that.
It is maybe the big difference in approach between me and Gregory, I would say. I don't know whether Gregory agrees, but I believe that, again, I'm sorry that my book is in Italian, but I believe one of the big differences is that Gregory's book is much about the singular. It's very much focused on the idea of singularity, whereas I do think that in the science of logic, there is a section where the problem of plurality really comes into play. There is a beautiful book by Andrew Haas. It's called Hegel's Theory of Multiplicity, that also has this kind of reading of the science of logic. And
Yes.
Sorry. It's
maybe to jump in. Yeah, the Haas book is good. It's a very good book on multiplicity. Yeah, I mean, the question isn't really whether there's multiplicities of singulars, but how. Right? So, like, on my view, it's, I don't know, once I can read the translated version of the Italian masterpiece, then I'll be able to engage a little more.
No, it won't be a translation. I will not inflict that to you. It would be a whole new book.
You'll give us the summary, and then you can fill us in on the details in conversation. But the one way to think of it is that you have singularity as self-singularizing. So just like you could talk about self-particularization, you can speak of self-singularization. In other words, that singularity itself multiplies itself through its own power. It's a self-singularizing being. And therefore, the relations that it has with others is a relation it has placed itself in. Now, I think that is a way of understanding personality, because you can think of personality as we have a subject who is free, who's self-determining. And I don't think you can have self-determination, say my self-determination or the pragmatics of self-determination, without Einzelheit, which is really the principle of all agency. And I think it's relatively clear from the section of the logic that what we're dealing with, the logic of subjectivity, is the logic of the agency of singularity. So kind of by my reading, it's still very metaphysical, but I think that one can acknowledge the multiplicity as a function of as self-singularizing agency that then can express itself in forms of personality of free persons. But, you know, this is really difficult stuff, and we probably need a few more hours to work it all out. But it's a fascinating passage there that you've raised there. We need a whole seminar just on this sentence. That's the singularity. I know that's your book. Singularity is a principle of individuality and personality. It really brings individuality and singularity together. So then the question is individuality really something that is beyond what can be defined? Or is it in fact something that in fact can very well be explicated because singularity itself can be, and individuality is explained on account of that, right? Or is there something about individuality, it depends on singularity, that can be clarified, but there's something that's still somehow exceeding what can be said. There's a lot of questions that come up here. This is really a beautiful sentence and a beautiful passage.
One question I quickly pose is, what the weight you have to place on principle? If individuality is the principle of singularity, then we've sort of shifted things a little bit. It's like the hidden soul of singularity. And so you can go either way, it seems to me.
Maybe we should...
absolutely.
Yeah, last word, Alice. Last word. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, just sorry. No, just a quick remark. Maybe with all the differences, which are of course very relevant, but when maybe Martin speaks about pragmatics, Gregory about agency, I speak about dynamism. There is a common idea that to me is interesting, namely that, so to say, Hegel can be accounted as one philosopher that comes up with the idea that individuality is something that has to do with something that you have to do, so to say, with a dynamic process, with some sort of, I don't know what the general term could be, not a static set of features, so to say. And maybe that there is an interesting way of reading Hegel, because it anticipates some ideas. I think about Simon Don, I think about Gilles Deleuze, I think about the theories of individuation. So the idea that when you think about individuality, you have to think about something you do and about something that happens, and not about a static configuration of something, so to say, which to me is a very relevant idea, so to say.
Well said. Nice way to wrap it up there, Alison, to bring us together in our difference, in our multiplicity, to unify us. Give us a theory of multiplicity here and do it. I think a part of your personality. Indeed, I think question of your personhood. Any final thoughts or just comments before we sign off? We went a little longer today because we had the introductory remarks and the introductions. Okay, well, thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Martin, for the wonderful and rich talk, and thanks to everyone
thank you for your questions.
Yes, thank you, Alex, for co-hosting this with me, and
thank you.
We'll see you the next talk. Do we know when the next talk is? We do know, we have a schedule.
Yes, it is next week on May 17th. We have Stathis Gourgouris, who is a professor of comparative literature at Columbia University. He's also written, since we are showing books. Yes, he's written a beautiful book. It's called The Perils of the One, and which is an interesting book because it's somehow a critical book against singularity and against the idea of one. So it's I believe Gregory will have so much to say about it. And the day after, exceptionally, we have Michael Della Rocca, who is going to have another talk. So we have 2 talks in a row next week, and then we are going to stop for a while. But the complete schedule is available, of course, on the mailing list, and we will try to send out so much information as possible. If you want to be updated about the events, please write your email address either to me or to Gregory or here in the chat, and we will be glad to include you in our mailing list.
Great. Okay, thanks everyone. Hopefully I'll see everybody next week. Thanks again, Martin. Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you, Martin. This was great. And thanks, Greg.
Thanks.
See you soon.